Good morning, everyone. Sir, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing good, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to inform that Symbiosis Law School Noida with AZB and partners has organized a webinar series titled Masterclass Corporate M&A Transactions in the month of December 2020. The masterclass on corporate M&A transactions will be delivered by the master himself, Mr. Hardeep Sachdeva, Senior Partner, AZB and Partners. There are three which are scheduled in the month of December 2020, wherein topics such as key corporate M&A transactions, financing transactions, and business transactions will be dealt and deliberated upon. It is indeed an honor for me to introduce to the August gathering Mr. Hardeep Sachdeva, Senior Partner, AZB and Partners. Mr. Hardeep Sachdeva is a Senior Partner at AZB and Partners. With more than 25 years experience, he advises Indian and multinational clients and is consistently rated as India's leading corporate and M&A lawyer. Mr. Hardeep advises across all sectors, including foundation, impact sector investments, real estate, retail, hospitality, e-commerce, education, technology, infrastructure, manufacturing, and others. Mr. Hardeep has been associated with several landmark M&A and private equity investment and financing transactions and has done pioneering work within and outside India in both listed and unlisted companies and on numerous acquisitions, joint ventures, including cross-border transactions. He advises clients on investment strategies, transaction structure, and drafting and negotiating of transaction documents. He advises companies and foundations on their India entry strategy. Mr. Hardeep has been a member of governmental and other industry committees. In 1995, he joined Ajay Behel and Company, a Delhi-based corporate law firm, which was one of the predecessor firms that formed AZB and Partners in the year 2004. He has been a key member of AZB Partners since. Mr. Hardeep has been ranked for real estate by Chambers Asia Pacific, highly regarded for M&A by IFLR 1000, recommended for real estate by Legal 500 Asia Pacific, recognized as a leading practitioner for real estate by the International Who's Who Legal, recognized as a distinguished practitioner for real estate and as a leading lawyer for construction and real estate, corporate M&A, investment funds and private equity by Asia Law Profiles. Without much ado, I would request Mr. Rajneesh Jindal, who would be moderating the session, to set the tone and explain the rules of housekeeping to the August gathering. Over to you, Mr. Rajneesh.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And to all. And regarding this masterclass, I just want to say that this mergers and acquisitions, or should I say survival of the fittest, this subject has become a synonym to this phrase coined by Mr. Herbert Spencer. This statement can be corroborated by the fact that in the last 5 years, more than 3,600 mergers and acquisition deals of worth more than $300 billion have taken place in India. So, as a budding legal professional, especially of corporate domain, this area paves the road for a successful career ahead, and it is in this journey, the guidance and expertise of a master of this field will definitely help you out to strengthen your knowledge and the learning. So, without taking much of your time, I just want to hand over the reign of this master class to the master of this area of this, that is mergers and acquisitions. So, welcome all to the world full of learning. So, I just hand over it to Hardeep sir. Please, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ramaldale, and thank you, Rajneesh. And good morning to everyone who are attending this session. And ideally, I would love to have these sessions in person so that I can see all of you. I can see some, smiling faces, and I can have as interactive as possible a session, which is, which is the best source of learning as opposed to a one-way traffic. But yes, I'll still share some of my thought process and experience on this area of practice where I have been from last over 25 years now, and also more so because if I go back to my curriculum when I done law, we did not have any such subject called M&A corporate law, or this practice being taught as a specific subject to us when we done law. I mean, subject in the sense that we have, of course, learned Contract Act, or we have also, learned various other laws, Companies Act or income tax, which are relevant for our practice. But just learning what this practice is a different dynamics. So whenever me and Ramal Day speak, I always that we should let our kids know that what we do in the corporate M&A, it has various components, and we need to understand what all goes into it when we speak about a corporate lawyer or a corporate M&A lawyer. And one of the most important or the largest component of this practice is what we have nomenclated is transactions. So transactions is a very basic, simple English word, which is, you're transacting in your goods, services, banking, money, whatever the transaction can be. It's just, two parties transacting with each other. And this is what is the biggest component when we speak about the corporate M&A transactions or the corporate M&A practice here. So of our lawyers are also these days called transaction lawyers or transactional lawyers, because they understand any transaction which may first of all itself be a large corporate M&A transaction, or which may emanate from that large corporate M&A transaction, but maybe a subset of it. So it may be part of a large transaction going on, but somebody may still, get hold of, let's say, business transaction part of it, or a financing transaction part of it, or some other part of it, which could be, anything else, which is getting into these transactions here. Now, what I've done is that I had divided my sessions into 3 different buckets. And why these 3 different buckets? Because these 3 are the key buckets or the key areas of transactions when we speak about corporate M&A practice. And these 3 areas, I don't know if we have it in front of us somewhere. These 3 were the key corporate M&A transactions. As to what those transactions are, that I'll speak about. And second is, and very importantly, for every such transaction, there is need of a financing of that transaction, a funding of that transaction, or investments or the money part of it, which is the financing transactions, which is, again, it can by itself be one transaction, or it can be part of a component of the larger M&A that we are doing. And third is the business transactions. In any large corporate deals or large corporate joint ventures, you will always find there is a business reason behind it. So the third category is the business transactions here, which take you through what those business transactions are and how they are interwoven very well with the large corporate deals or the M&A deals here. I'll first start with the first, which is the corporate M&A transactions, and the very first category there is the joint ventures. I'm sure we all can understand what a joint venture means. And from a lawyer's perspective and from a practice perspective as well, a joint venture is as simple as 2 or more parties or 2 or more companies or persons bringing their resources, their strength, their contributions together to do business together. So jointly doing a venture or a joint venture is what it's all about. Now, when we speak about a joint venture, we need to look at the history of joint ventures that we see in our country here, and why I'm shifting so much quickly from a definition perspective to what we need to understand what a joint venture is. Historically, history, 25, 30 years I will talk about. I will not go history means, your medieval history and the ancient history. When India opened up, there was a need that India had, which need was some technology to be given to our companies from various other countries or companies operating in these other countries for our manufacturing or some of those sectors to start manufacturing that world-class products. So, as an example, when we had one of the very first successful car company set up in India, there was a joint venture between in Government of India. At that time, it was called Maruti, and a Japanese car manufacturer called Suzuki. So Maruti Suzuki formed a joint venture, and what did they do? The Indian government opened up the Indian market. They gave this joint venture vehicle all the licenses required or the land required to set up the manufacturing plant. And of course, the Indian market was available at that point in time. And the Japanese car maker at the same time got access to Indian market. They had the technology. They had the technology to make fuel efficient, faster, smaller, better cars than what we already had in the country. And that became one of the very successful joint ventures in India for years to come, for years and years to come here. So joint venture simply means when two or more parties are contributing their resources, their strength to whatever they can contribute into a joint venture between two parties to make it a successful sort of a joint venture here. Now, joint ventures can be of, on a very satellite level, can be of two different categories again. One can be incorporated joint ventures, and one can be in unincorporated joint ventures. Now, incorporated are the one where two parties set up a joint venture company or incorporate a company or similar other outfit to do their business together, which could be a joint venture company, the example that I just gave you, which is Maruti Suzuki. Other could be any other limited liability partnership, LLP vehicle, or a partnership company can be set up here between two partners, which are the joint venture partners, where they are doing their business together through that vehicle, which is the incorporated joint ventures. The other joint ventures model could be unincorporated joint ventures. When two or more parties are joining hands, they are working together, contributing their respective distribution networks or IPRs or technology or their strength and resources, but are not contributing it into any company or a similar body corporate, but they are having an alliance or they're having a consortium agreement where they agree to work together, but they do not pass it on to any company. So examples of these could be consortiums which are bidding for doing road concessions or bidding for doing the airport construction here, where consortium members will contribute their part of their contributions or commitments and will get paid in return for that. But they will not be committed for a never-ending vehicle called a joint venture company or a limited liability partnership here. If you look around some of the biggest, or some of the most known joint ventures companies in India, if you still look at, Delhi and Noida where we operate from, I will say DMRC, Delhi Metro Rail Corporation. Even DMRC is nothing but a joint venture between the government of India, which is central government, and the Delhi state government, where both these governments, through their respective, departments, own 50% shareholding in the incorporated company called Delhi Metro Rail Corporation Limited. This is a incorporated joint venture example here. If we look at some of the biggest joint ventures visibly known to us today, or which are so optically known, which are all public knowledge, first could be our Vistara Airlines. It's a joint venture between Tata's and Singapore Airlines. Why would Tata's do joint venture with anybody? They themselves were the founder of the first ever airline company in India. They are the biggest conglomerate in the country here. They are from salt to steel maker sort of a business. Yes, they still need the partnership to get the best possible technology and the efficiencies and the business efficiencies to run airline. Therefore, they done a joint venture end of the day with the foreign party to make sure that they are starting with that, with that sort of a level where they do not have to reinvent the wheel. They could have done it themselves, but it may have taken them far more time, far more inefficiencies to come to a level where they have reached just by having a partner in place, where the partner also got access to large India, one of the largest India airline market, and an Indian company got partnership to get to fly the best here today. What a joint venture is. Now, other examples could be again stick to aviation or airlines. We have AirAsia as well, where Tata's again done a joint venture with AirAsia of Malaysia. Why they done two joint ventures? Because that is in a different segment. This is a different segment here. Or other joint ventures in India. If you look around today, you look around any insurance company, your Bharti AXA or your Bajaj Alliance or your PNB MetLife. All these are joint ventures between a foreign insurance company and the Indian, either a financial conglomerate or a financial industrial house, which had the interest to get into this business here. And they set up their own joint venture companies to get into this insurance business here. There are more examples of joint ventures all over. I mean, which are, again, some of these examples could be, now somebody can say that foreign companies are not allowed to have 100% shareholding in some sectors. Therefore, by law, they are compulsorily required to have a joint venture partner, which is right in some sectors. Maybe could be in print media, in some of the defense, or there are some more sectors where they still cannot have 100% shareholding, and therefore there is a requirement for them to have a joint venture partner. But then there are some which are done to make sure that the respective contributions are made to make to start from a point which is making them far ahead of others when they start the business there. Now, when we started or when I started practicing, started working as lawyer in 1995, the buzzword used to be joint ventures. I mean, joint venture was our highest amount of, or the largest amount of work that we used to do, write these joint venture agreements. And along with the joint venture agreements, as I spoke about, there are other contributions by each party, which could be distribution network, could be technology transfer, could be technical services. We used to write these agreements quite often for all the companies coming to India, or for Indian companies tying up with other Indian companies. But historically, from last, at least, if I can say that, if I start from 1991 or 1992, which when the Indian economy opened up, from that time till now, for some 28, 29 years, the number of joint ventures in India have shrunk largely to the sector where there is a need for a joint venture. Now, need can be need driven by the regulations or the need driven by the business itself, both. So today we don't see that every company is having a joint venture in India. Historically, if you remember, we've seen that even every car company that came to India, so or every motorcycle company or automobile company came to India, or a Hero, Honda, Bajaj, Kawasaki, Yamaha with Escorts, or a Toyota tying up with Kirloskar, they still have this joint venture with a very minuscule shareholding by Kirloskar, or Mercedes tying up with Indian partners here. That doesn't happen anymore. That just doesn't happen anymore. We do not see these joint ventures happen today just for the sake of it. We see joint ventures happening today when there is a real need and a real contribution by two joint venture parties into a joint venture here. So today, joint ventures, when you look around, as I give you some examples, like aviation sector or a defense sector or some other sectors, they are the one where there is real contribution made by each party to do that business together. Otherwise, largely, which will be my subset point number B, I'll take you through there. Largely, there'll be share acquisition transactions where people will take shares for the financial investments. They will not, buy into each other's company for doing the strategic investment here. And we again used to divide these investments into two buckets here. One is business strategies, which is strategic investments. where you expand your market share, get into new markets, get into new areas of functioning, or the financial investments here, where you just simply make investment to make money out of it. And I remember once, long ago, I learned that when people buy businesses, or when they do strategic investments, they just don't do it for making money. That was not usually the objective or the main objective of people making, or these large corporates making strategic investments. They made investments to gain market share. They made these investments means setting up, starting their businesses, doing their joint ventures in a market segment or in a country. They do it to expand their business into that country. They do it to end of the day to dilute their competition in that market, to eliminate competition in the market here. There are various reasons for them or for a business corporate to make a strategic investment there. But for financial investments, the motive is simple, which is return on the investment that you will make into any company or any project there. So I'll just come back to again joint ventures. Joint ventures are again driven by not money, but by resources, by contribution of two partners, two parties into a joint venture. And when we start discussing joint ventures, start writing joint ventures from a law perspective, I feel there are 5 very key components for any joint venture, whether it is incorporated or it is unincorporated, whether it is meant for a strategic reason or it is meant for gaining market share, it is meant for gaining technology. The 5 key components that I feel are very important to write in any joint venture or any joint venture agreements that we write here. First and foremost is the governance of that joint venture vehicle or that joint venture system or that alliance. And the governance starts, if it is a company, starts with the board of directors, the quorum, the reserve matters, the veto matters that we call them. And the veto matters are the matters where the approval of each partner is must before a matter is discussed or passed or implemented by the joint venture company or the joint venture, body or joint venture or partnership or joint venture outfit there. After governance, second most important or most hotly contested all over the world element of joint venture is the provisions governing the transfer of joint venture parties' stake in the joint venture. Any stake that one joint venture partner has into a joint venture, the provisions governing the transfer of that stake. Now, transfer can also mean when I want to exit or when I want to dilute or when I want to sell to my affiliate for any, internal restructuring purposes. That is usually the most complicated part of any joint ventures. Why most complicated? Because you always have the other partner who may want to buy it out. You may always have the other partner who may not want you to sell out to a competitor, who may always have other partner who may ask you to first you contribute what you're supposed to contribute in terms of your technical strength, your name, your IPRs into the partnership or into the venture here before you exit. Who may expect you to be locked in for this venture for 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Or who may expect that when you sell me also along. Therefore, there is a huge amount of expectation alignment that needs to be done in a joint venture agreement, which is the provisions governing transfer of joint venture partners' stake, which could be in the form of equity shares, preference shares, your convertible debentures, your any other convertible instruments or warrants or whatever else you have here, or your partnership stake, etc., into any joint venture. Or even if it is a consortium here, before a consortium member can exit, what should be the obligations of that exiting consortium members to ensure that the liabilities and obligations of that consortium until that date is fully assumed by the exiting partners, and etc. Third and very key component of joint venture agreements, which should have been the first one, but the first one is basically the presumption that this is why you're having a joint venture. So when you start writing joint venture agreements, the third very key component that gets into joint venture agreements or documents is the clarity on the contribution by each party to the joint venture. And as I mentioned, this could be in the form of just technology transfer can start with us. If it is a joint venture for making, alcoholic beverages in India, it can be your mixture, your formula, your secret sauce that you may want to share with this joint venture company, or your trademark with which the joint venture company can sell the products in the market, or the distribution network. If you're buying and selling into, let's say, something which requires a large distribution network like your FMCG product today, if you're buying and selling into TV or refrigerator, you need to have the distribution network of 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20,000 dealers and retailers with you. That contribution that one party brings to the joint venture needs to be laid out very clearly. Only laid out clearly in your joint venture agreement, and how you contribute that itself is a business transaction, which is my point number 3. Other business transaction means that when you are setting up a joint venture vehicle, you will each own shares in that joint venture vehicle, a joint venture company, and each will commit, I will do these 5 things for the joint venture, but I will do these 5 things in accordance with the respective agreement that I will sign with the joint venture company. So as an example, I can say that I will contribute my technology to this joint venture company, but to contribute technology, I have to technology transfer or a technology license, depending on what I'm contributing, the life duration of that contribution, perpetual or fixed term, etc., etc. Therefore, I will sign a technology agreement with the joint venture company there, which can be co-terminus with the life of the joint venture, or which can exist for 5-10 years post even termination. It all depends on how expectations, which the previous point, how expectations are matched or aligned when one party wants to exit, or one party may have to exit from a joint venture here. Fourth, which is not a very happy one, but very important one, is the provisions pertaining to an event of default or an event of breach of respective covenants and obligations to the joint venture. Now, why is it so important to cover it? Because that event need not always lead to a court deciding your dispute or an arbitrator deciding your dispute. Sometimes, with all due respect to our judiciary, sometimes the matters which are involved in these joint ventures are so overly complicated because of the technology, because of the market conditions, because of various other factors. They are best decided in a way which can be implemented through the judiciary, as opposed to, or through the arbitrators, as opposed to them resolving your disputes in a different manner. So what is important is that if a default occurs, nobody is trying to decipher that technology as to who will, up to what level and who will do what. It should simply be what will happen to the fate of each party's shareholding or each party's stake in the joint venture. Will one party buy other party out if the default occurs? If that buyout is happening, is there a clarity as to what is the pricing that needs to be determined at which the buyout should occur, or the buyout may occur? Or is that party in default bound to sell its shares at a discount to that party, the discount to the fair market price, so that these things can be easily implementable through the process of law when there is a dispute here? And then we still need some more governing right. If there is a default here, then who will keep the technology transferred to the joint venture vehicle till that date? Who will keep the brands and the trademarks which are started by the joint venture company? And there could be endless, limitless sort of discussions one can have there, but we still need to get a clarity in terms of what needs to go into when there is an event of default there. to make sure that we're not, getting into resolving your overly complex business issues by the courts. We are resolving your business transactions implementable through the process of court and the arbitration sale. That's very, very important here. And in some of the joint ventures, we used to also write about hiring the experts to resolve the disputes between the joint venture partners, because sometimes those disputes can only be resolved by the experts only, and cannot really be resolved somebody who doesn't understand that part of the business there. Therefore, very important to have an event of default clause which will lay the whole path as to what will happen if the default occurs. Last but not the least is the dispute resolution mechanism, which is linked to the event of default. But how will that dispute be resolved? That's also equally important to write in your joint venture agreements that we write. Now, I can assure you that we can keep speaking about each and every word about joint ventures and finish the class with joint venture only, because it's such an area, such a topic where, there's a lot more to share, a lot more to talk, but I'll just still come to, other two things that I kept for today for us, which are very important to understand, because we are discussing this whole corporate M&A part of it in the first go. So I'll also now quickly come to the next level of it, or the next part of it. Again, joint ventures, two parties. Why joint venture? Because each parties are bringing something on the table from their side. What are they bringing? Could be technology, could be market, could be trademark, could be IPRs, could be land, could be building, could be human resource. Let's say today there are these joint ventures for the security agency companies. The Indian security agency company will have access to the human resource of 5,000 security guards. The foreign company may know how to equip them better, may have better systems to do the better guarding of houses and the industrial places or the commercial places, and therefore the joint venture. So what people can contribute in today's time, in today's time and world here, when we speak technology, the contribution could be enormous, could be anything. Somebody can really contribute an idea, somebody can contribute, the market segment. Therefore, the joint ventures, two parties are joining hands, doing business. Need not to be confused with the financial investments, which is the second part of it. Financial investments are when you're making investments of money, could be in any company across any sector, but your objective is that you will not become the party to run the business here. You will of course have some rights given to you as part of your investments, which are what we still call them negative control rights, where you can say no to certain acts of the company, depending on your shareholding that you're taking in a company here. But you are there in the company, you are there in the project, there in that partnership, only for the financial reason, not really for the business reason of it. If you're getting business reason out of it, that's all right. That's still not be a joint venture. It all depends what you're contributing into the company here. And that is different from the joint ventures that we just spoke about here. Second thing is your shares and security transactions. I think before second, I may want to jump to the third one first, then we'll come to the second, because third is very, very important, a very interesting thing. Third thing I covered here is, I think, is the business transfers. Now, one of the key component of the corporate M&A practice for us is when people are buying and selling businesses. So example, when somebody is selling a hotel, a running hotel, when a company sells a running hotel to another company, the question is often asked to us, what are they selling? Are they selling land and building? Are they selling the rooms with the furniture, with the fixtures? Are they selling, the name of the hotel or the location? The answer is no, they're not selling anything in isolation of a running hotel business. You're not itemizing what you are selling. What you're selling is a running hotel, running operating hotel, which has, obviously it has land, it has building, it has rooms. It also has hundreds of employees running it. Employees are there, human resources there to run it. It has the government licenses and approvals to run it. It also has liabilities to run it. The liabilities are the amount payable to the vendors, to the creditors, to the lenders. It's an undertaking that you sell. We call it business undertaking. So when you sometimes buy, or sometimes when you read about somebody has bought something which looks like bought a brand, usually it's not the brand, usually it's not the hotel. So recently a big brand was sold, by company A to company B into maybe in electronic or in some other sectors as well. When we speak about those brands being sold, so you're not just buying the trademarks. Usually what you buy is whatever goes into that brand, which is starting from the manufacturing undertaking. So you buy out the manufacturing undertaking, and there also you're not just simply buying the manufacturing shed or the plant and machinery. What you buy is a combination of your plant, machinery, asset, liabilities, movables, immovables, your employees, your HR, your licenses, your approvals, your contracts, your IPRs, your technology. On the top of everything, you buy the goodwill. You buy the goodwill of that business. So when you buy these businesses, you do not buy items. You cannot differentiate or divide the components of the business that you buy. You buy them, what we call it, on a going concern basis, on a slump sale basis. A slump sale is a defined term under the income tax. But then the question, people ask, why are you then selling the hotel? Why are you getting into this complication of, buying a asset, liability, movable, immovable, employees, contracts? You will have to transfer employees from company B. Why can't you sell the company only? Why can't somebody sell a company which owns a hotel or company which owns a brand here? Yes, that's a very good question. Because selling a company means selling shares of the company, which could be far easier to implement. Just sell the shares. You will become the owner of whatever is there in the company. But at times, the need of the buyer and seller requires the business undertaking to be sold here. And what that need could be, let's say if I have 5 hotels, but you want to buy only one, but I have 5 in my company. It means you can't buy my company. I have to sell only one to you. It means you will have to buy it from me on a slump sale on a business transfer basis. And sometimes if I'm a buyer and you are the one who may have single business, single asset, or single running brand in your company which you want to sell to me, but I do not want to buy your company because it may have baggage which could be your 30 or 40-year-old company which may have some different past dues, past liabilities, litigations which I do not want to inherit when I'm buying a clean brand or a clean business here. Therefore, at that time, as the need of the buyer, I may not buy your company, but I'll buy your business. So it all depends on the need of the buyer and the seller when they determine to sell the business as a single piece of business sale as opposed to selling the company here. Now, when we speak about a business transfer, as I just touched upon it, what you sell or what you buy, if I can still categorize into 6 or 7 different components, and again, these cannot be differentiated because you will have to sell the business on a going concern basis. But when you write your business transfer agreement, you will still have to write some components of business which are getting transferred to you. Those components start with assets that you're buying. Assets could be your movable, immovable. And movables are your, obviously, your plant, machinery, your stock and trade. Your immovables are your land, building that you're buying here. Second, more importantly, is the liabilities that you're inheriting when you buy business. Because you're buying business on a going concern basis, and obviously there'll be some liabilities that'll come to you. Those will have to be well defined. The quantum of loan which is getting transferred to you, who are the the lenders, or the creditors getting transferred to you. Who are those creditors to whom you have to pay? Or the business payments in the due course or in the running course, or the employee liabilities that you're inheriting for the gratuities, for the superannuation, which are liabilities which you will have to discharge because you are taking all those employees into your fold, or any other liability which is attached to it. Could be any ongoing litigations, claims, etc. That needs to be well defined in a business transfer. Assets, liabilities, both will have to be first defined in a business transfer here. Third is employees. Who are the employees getting transferred as part of your business? Which will have to be all employees, all relevant employees in a business that are getting transferred from company A to from a seller to a buyer here. Fourth is your business contracts. Your business, let's say if I'm in the business of manufacturing and selling Sony TV. To sell my televisions, I will have to have dealers in place. I will have the contracts with my dealers, with my retailers. I will have contracts with my vendors, suppliers, so supplying me anything. Those business contracts will have to be transferred as part of business to the ultimate buyer of the business here. So the business contracts which are written as part of the business will also have to go to the business transfer. Your fourth is your, as I mentioned, your licenses, your government approvals, your licenses to do the businesses. It can start with your factory license, your manufacturing, your sanctions, your environment licenses. All those will have to be transferred from the seller to the buyer here. And as a thumb rule, most of these licenses are non-transferable. Thumb rule. Even if they have to be transferred, but they are non-transferable without the consent of the authority granted you the license. It means that you will have to go back to the authority which gave you the license, take their consent. But that can be post facto as well, that can be pre as well. It all depends which license is that. But because you need the continuity of business, so as an example, a GST number can't be transferred from the seller to the buyer here. But on the date of closing, you need to give yourself, good 6-7 days these days to get all the new sales switched to the new GST number. I mean, the detailing can be as sharp as that. Few things can be transferred, few things can be reapplied by you afresh, so that you can just start doing the business on the date when you are taking as a cutoff date or a closing date to buy the business over. Other two key components, I'll first say the IPRs, which could have been part of your movables, but they are not those routine movables. Therefore, they're always mentioned separately. You are buying certain intellectual property rights. Copyrights, could be your patents, could be anything else that you're buying as part of the business. Those will have to be defined there. And last but the goodwill that you're buying at the business here. And these 7 things makes a business. When you buy a business on a slump sale basis and pay for the business on a lump sum basis, you're paying on a lump sum basis. You're not paying any itemized price. You're not paying X for the property asset or Y for the employees. You're paying a lump sum consideration. Buying the business on a running basis is called a business transfer agreements. These are the transfers or the business undertakings that happens between two companies. The reason I told you very well, it is the need of the buyer, need of the seller when you do the business transfers here. And then in this whole business transfer as well, some components, although these should ideally be part of the same business, need to be, or the sale of some component needs to be implemented through a different instrument. So as an example, when you are transferring a trademark, you will have to still sign a trademark assignment agreement separately from transfer of a business transfer agreement, and then get it registered with the trademark registrar. If any such business has any immovable property and there is a land and business, land and building to it, you will have to sell that land and building through a registered sale deed, pay stamp duty on that, and register that with the sub registrar. So like that, there could be some components that may still require you to go back to some different government agency or a a registrar or a body to register yourself and implement a sale of a component of the business in your name, but your intention has to be clear that you're selling the business on a going concern basis. And you're paying a lump sum price, not itemized price for each item separately here. And if you know, as we speak about some of the examples of business, which is hotel or your manufacturing units or the brands that you buy and sell, normally how much time do we have? Have we jumped or we still have time?
We still have 45 minutes, including question and answers.
Yeah, so I'll just take another short this thing on the share security transaction, and then we'll quickly take the question answer, because I want to really have some part of my responses by looking at the questions that people are asking there. I think the second part that I covered here is on the corporate M&A transaction was the shares and securities transactions. Now, when somebody is doing a joint venture, or when somebody is making a financial investment, you usually buy shares of a company. Usually buy shares of a company. Yes, there are more possible avenues of making these investments. I'm not getting into, let's say, you buying into units of a trust which is doing the AIF business or a mutual fund business, or you are investing into LLP stake. So those are also there, but your majority or a super majority or a super majority of your of our work is to advise on the investments by investing into the shares or the securities issued by the companies to the investor or the shareholder. Now, this investor, when I speak investor here in this category, it can include the joint venture partners as well. But primarily, I'm talking about investments made by any private equity investors, any financial investors, any hedge fund, startup fund, angel fund, whatever nomenclature we can give them. When investors are making investments into a company, these are what we call the securities or share transactions. So what goes into it is when I'll pick two key parts here. When somebody is investing into equity shares of a company, means you know exactly what you're buying into today. So today when I buy equity shares and pay price for it, the contingency of the pricing of the deal in future are limited. Contingency in the sense that the conditionalities attached to that deal for the pricing or my shareholding percentage in future is limited. I will define my rights as a shareholder in a company, and those rights are again depending on how much money I'm contributing, how much shareholding I'm taking, what level I'm coming into a company. Is it nascent stage, early stage, mid stage, series A, series B? It all depends on that. Or am I taking a very high stake in the company here, and therefore my rights will be proportionate to what I am buying into the company, which is equity investments where I'm paying for the shares that I'm getting today, which is usually implemented into two forms. One is a primary transaction where the shares are issued and allotted by the company itself to the incoming shareholder, means a fresh allotment has happened by the company. They'll pass resolutions, they issue fresh shares to the incoming subscriber of those shares, and money will be received by the company only, by the issuing company or by the issuer. We call it primary. Means there are primary shares which are not in existence till now, are now getting issued and allotted to the investor or a shareholder or incoming member. Second way could be secondary deal, when there are shares already issued and allotted, who's holding these shares from quite some time, or may have been holding for a short or a medium or a long time, is selling these shares to the incoming shareholder, where the money is paid to the selling shareholder, where the company is not getting paid, but the company is acknowledging the transaction and therefore giving all the rights which are agreed between these two shareholders. Means the shareholder who is selling, a selling shareholder, And the shareholder who is buying means the buying shareholder. And the company which is the issuer of these shares are acknowledging and agreeing for certain shareholders' right, which will be there in place between these two group of shareholders there. So primary or secondary equity investments, when they are done in any of these modes here, when you fix the price and fix the percentage, this is what we call a vanilla equity transactions, where we write a share subscription agreement or a share purchase agreement, depending on whether it is a primary or a secondary. But yes, buying those shares, paying for it. And when you buy those shares or take those shares from the company, pay for it, you have certain set of reps and warranties given to you by the shareholder or the company, depending on what the deal is. But the other part of the share deals or the security deals could be when you are not fixing the full price of the shares today, or when you are buying something which is convertible into shares tomorrow. So you can buy a already convertible preference shares. Means today you're not equity shareholder, you're a preference shareholder. You will have some preference over the equity shareholder for a dividend or a winding up the seats, but you may not have, let's say, a limitless dividend. So one can fix dividend to a preference shareholders, and remaining can go to equity shareholder. But you have the right to convert yourself into equity shareholding of the company at a predetermined or a pre-agreed time or a pre-agreed valuation in future, either the time or valuation in future. So I can agree that today you're holding my preference shares, which are compulsorily convertible into equity shares, but I'll convert you not today. I'll convert you 2 years from now, because by that time I will have my company's performance, going multifold, and I'll convert you at a price which will be determined at my audited financials 2 years hence. Those are compulsorily convertible preference shares, or the deals where the shares will be given to that incoming shareholder not today, or equity shares not today, at a later time and date. And this convertible instrument could be convertible warrants, it could be your convertible debentures to begin with. But yes, you can keep earning interest on those debentures, because debentures are issued by the Indian company. But yes, at some point in time, these will be converted into equity shares of the company at a pre-agreed valuation formula. So today I can agree to a formula which could be based on my sales, my revenue, my profits, anything else, my market share. It all depends on the two parties, where the issuer or the other shareholder and the incoming shareholder or the investor, as to what could be that formula for the conversion of that security instrument that I'm giving you today to get you to that desired equity share stake in the company. So in the first round, we spoke about what I call vanilla equity deals, where if I'm paying for some shares, I'm getting those shares today. In second round, I'm paying for it, but I'll get it. I'm paying for it today. I'll get something today which is not equity shares. I may get a convertible warrant or a debenture or a preference shares, but my equity shares will be given to me depending on the mutually agreed terms future, or at a event in future. Point to event. Event could be when I'm doing a next round of funding here. So before I give shares to the new investor, I'll give you shares at the price that I agree to give shares to the new investor, as an example. Or if I want to do an IPO, I'll give you shares on the basis of, it is a 3 merchant banker valuation 6 months ahead of IPO or 3 months ahead of IPO, because you can't time IPO with the allotment of shares. So these second group of transactions, which are security and share transactions, are dominating today in the corporate M&A transactions, which are largely the financial investments. And if you look around, at least in the last 7 years, since the time we've seen the outburst of the new age economy of e-commerce, or the digital revolution, or the Olas and Ubers and Oyos, the investments that have happened into these company are largely financial investments, and these investments have not, in most of the cases, have not given shares to the investors on the very first go. These are the investments which were structured to give shares to these investors at some times or a date in future, depending on various events. So there are Series A, Series B, Series C investments that has happened, or maybe sometimes even simple vanilla equity investments happen where you can agree, where two parties can still agree to the valuation of a company today itself and can agree to give shares to one party. So if I quickly summarize things that we touched upon today for corporate or M&A transactions, is there the most interesting part of it, which is the joint ventures between two parties when they contribute, something more than just money into the venture. Second is the shares or the securities transactions where the contribution is primarily financial contribution. It is the equity contribution, which is the financial contribution. So as an example there, um, Flipkart raising money from Tiger Global. It is largely financial transaction here. Or pick up any example. I just picked up some random name. We can pick up any name where people are raising money from other only for the purposes of growing the business. They are not truly getting the strategic input or a business additions to their businesses. These are just the financial investments, which is largely the private equity industry or any other financial investment industry that we have here. Third, we looked at the business transfers as very important part of it in either of the above. Either it is a joint venture or it is a financial investment. Let's say if there's a investor who wants to invest into there's a large PE investor out of US who wants to invest into the hotel portfolio. It'll still be the case where you take out the hotel from the company through a business transfer into a new company. Or you may actually, one can say that you can actually take out the same business undertaking through the route of a demerger as well, which requires, approval of NCLT. Yes, you can do that, but it all depends how the whole thing is structured, how much time you have in hand to get this whole thing implemented, what are the savings that you are getting when you are following the route of, demerger versus following the route of a business transfer. But yes, even in a deal where you need a joint venture or you have a financial investment to structure it, you may still have a business transfers done into one special purpose vehicle where you have the joint venture parties taking shares, doing joint venture, or you have the financial investments taking place. You may still have a fully ready gear to take any investment into you, and therefore you can start with that by having any strategic investment or by having any your any financial investment there. So I think there I suggest we take a break and yeah. I don't know how people. This is where we miss seeing people face to face. Then you can see how many are. Yeah.
So yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
So I would request all the present gathering that those who have any question, just please raise your hand, and Mr. Rajneesh one by one will take your name. We would request you to announce your name and then have your video camera on and then pose the question. So please raise your hand. I would request that till you are not allowed to ask the question, please do not switch on the video mode. Once you are given that opportunity, please have the please switch on the video as well as the audio. Present your question to Mr. Hardeep. Over to you, Mr. Rajneesh.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you, Hardeep, sir. Thank you for this enriching session. So I would like to request all learners who have any questions, so they please raise your hands and yes, Arjun, you may please unmute yourself and you please switch on your video and you may please ask your question.
A very good afternoon, sir. My name is Arjun Sahani. I'm currently in my fourth year here, and it's an honor and a privilege to hear from you and listen to you about something that is part of my current coursework and something that is very dear to me, merger and acquisition and corporate transactions. Sir, so I'll keep my question very short. Recently, Lakshmi Vilas Bank has amalgamated with DBS Indian subsidiary, and DBS Singapore, through its Indian subsidiary, has injected about 2,500 crores into this deal. What all, in your opinion, possible benefits can DBS Singapore expect from this deal, given that RBI had just placed last month the bank on a moratorium and had said, and I quote, its finances have been seriously deteriorated and were mismanaged at some point in time? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think very good question. Very, very good question. I'm very happy to hear that people are so aware of what's happening in the. I must share something with you, Ramal. You know, I 3 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, I went to. I will not name. Went to one of the law school to do the campus recruitment, and I asked people there to tell me the. I asked a very generic question to the sort of a group of people there to tell me the company which is the highest market capitalization in the world. And you'll be surprised that at least half of them did not even know that. Did not even know that. Or maybe when I spoke to them, please give me the name of the five most wealthiest people in the world. Not that I wanted to know, but it is just how much you can grasp, when you read daily newspaper. So yeah, I'll quickly touch upon, the question here. Some of these mergers that we are speaking about when it comes to bank, they are not the mergers done by choice. They are the mergers done by the compulsion of the regulator. In this case, Reserve Bank of India is keenly watching the interest of the public depositors in the bank. So they're not largely, they of course are very concerned with the businesses or the banks, but they are watching the interest of public depositors. So whenever any bank comes to a point or come to a flashing point where the bank may fail public deposits, fail means that when the bank doesn't have money to keep paying the depositor, RBI quickly takes over that bank and merge it with some other bank which may have asked for that merger. So historically, if I can tell you, there was a bank called Global Trust Bank some 10 years ago, which overnight stopped people from withdrawing money. Next overnight, RBI requested Oriental Bank of Commerce to take over the bank in the interest of public depositors. But what they did not do at that point in time, they let the Class B lenders, there are these, Class A and Class B lenders to continue their lending in the bank there. It means while they protected the public depositors, those highly lenders or creditors to the bank also got protected. But in some of the recent takeovers that have happened, let's say Yes Bank, when the Yes Bank was going down, it was again quickly taken over by Reserve Bank of India and was given it to one of the nationalized bank to handle it temporarily. What they had done is that they wrote off the entire Class B lending of that bank so that it is very lucrative for any buyer of that bank to handle the equity part of it and service all the public depositors here. And why would somebody buy the bank? Because they don't have to pay the high risk creditors. They will only have to service the depositors. The deal all of a sudden will make, a very lucrative deal. Let's say if today, if it is not because of RBI, even in the RBL bank as well, if it is not because of RBI, if they wanted to sell this bank to somebody else, the buyer will still have to service every liability of the bank, including those, high risk lenders. But in this case, Reserve Bank of India has written off and forced write off of that Class B bonds of that bank here. So if I'm the buyer of this bank here, all of a sudden I'm getting two things. One, I can expand my footprints. I'm a smaller bank. I'll become a bigger bank. I'll have access to all their branches in one go. I will have to, of course, service the depositor. I will have to take over the NPAs. but I will not have to pay the unsecured high-risk lending that the bank had taken. So there are reasons for the buying of the bank or the merging of the bank with the buyer bank to do, which is increasing a footprint and not inheriting the unnecessary high-risk lending the bank had.
Understood, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you, sir. Thank you for this answer. And now I would like to request Sanjri to please unmute yourself and please switch on your video and ask your question. Sanjri.
Good afternoon, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Sanjri Rakesh Mistry. I'm a fourth year learner student from the 2017 to 2022 batch. So my question is regarding how can mergers and acquisitions help accelerate the food supply chains post COVID-19, especially due to them suffering during the pandemic. So my question is regarding how can, acquisitions or mergers help accelerate these chains after COVID-19 has ended?
No, very good question again. I must tell you that the mergers and acquisitions are usually result in the consolidation of positions of companies. So let's say if supply chain today in India, in my view, supply chain, if you look at supply chains 5 years ago, it was the most fragmented business, most fragmented small business all over the country. But thanks to the extreme investments which are made by e-commerce companies and then by some of the large investors, financial investors into the supply chains, including warehousing and the 3Ps, that whole supply chain is becoming far more consolidated. So if there is more investments, more consolidation means a more solid, robust supply chain as opposed to small fragmented supply chain. And I'll give you a small example. I advised frozen potato companies, which is one of the largest supplier of French fries in the world. I advised them in 1996. They could not succeed in India because India was not cold storage ready. We did not have enough refrigerators with people to cold store fries. So they could not do business in India, and India was not ready at that point in time. I mean, the second reason was India was not ready to grow bigger potatoes to make French fries. Our potato size used to be small. But gradually, what happens when these companies come to India? They start making investment into the processes of growing bigger potatoes or letting people buy refrigerators. The supply chain strengthens. Even if you look back here, I mean, at least Ramal Daisy can still connect. Some 30 years ago, to buy a cold drink, have it served cold to you was a luxury only, because people did not have the refrigerators in their shops. But today, you can't even imagine that you will have a shop which doesn't have refrigerator. But these things happened, over a span of time where I can tell you until 5 years ago, it was all highly fragmented. The consolidation happens. The real consolidation or the sizes happens when you have the M&A done in that sector. And obviously, when you have consolidations, you have more investments, one attract others. You'll have now today larger companies handling it. But we still not been able to resolve issues like distribution of COVID vaccine, which requires to be refrigerated at a minus 27 degrees. We do not have that facility in India, and it can't even be created. So yes, it will happen. But in last 5 years, if you ask me, there are large companies which are now created in warehousing and in the distribution and logistics, and therefore the whole supply chain has improved drastically.
Sir, just one more thing. So would it be beneficial for mergers to take place after, the pandemic is ended? So will it be beneficial for these companies, to merge together or acquire other larger investors in companies in order to, deal with the pandemic that has occurred for over a year now?
I can tell you one thing, although this example is not the best to give given COVID scenario, but every crisis brings opportunity. Remember that every crisis brings opportunity. There are ample companies which have gained size tremendously during COVID time. Tremendous is the word. All the digital platform companies, the Netflix of the world, have gained market share into a number you can't even imagine. The online education, the online banking, they're seeing a different life today, just different life. If you look at the amount of business done by Google Pay in India, they're the number one today, running into some lakhs of crores of rupees. Why? Because people were bound not to go out. So there is no, you can't time it. You can't time opportunity. You just have to avail opportunity. It has to be there in the market for the business people to avail it, to avail at that point in time.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for relating this point with the survival of the fittest, actually, and actually the apt answer of this question. Thank you very. So now I would like to request, please unmute yourself and please ask your question, Anvi, and please switch on your video.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, sir. My name is Anvi Jha, and I'm also a fourth-year student. Sir, thank you for a wonderful session. So my question also pertains to the pandemic, and I wanted to ask that how has this pandemic affected the retail sector in terms of the future opportunities for, retailers, brands, or other investors?
Thank you. So this, when you say retail sector, you have to keep in mind that that all the staple food is also retail sector. All your electronic goods is also retail sector. And I can tell you the quantum leap taken by the staple foods or the electronics in this country during pandemic is unprecedented. Unprecedented, that is also retail sector. But when you speak about retail sector, means your merchandise, obviously we all know that they've seen very, very dampening time, very dark time, because the malls were not operationals. Nobody was buying clothes at that time. You were buying food at this time. So yes, it has a different impact for different segments of the retail sector, end of the day. Can't really have a cast in stone sort of impact for all retail sector. But yes, but when you speak about retail malls in the country, obviously they've been through very, very tough time. I mean, very tough time. If for merchandise, if you look world over, no, some of the best retail brands have gone bankrupt. Just gone bankrupt. We have Brooks Brothers, one of the best brand for lawyers in US. It is like a uniform for lawyers in US. If they bought their suits from Brooks, they have a big store in New York and all over the downtown. But that is bankrupt because they could not sustain the rent. So we have more such retail merchandise brands in Europe as well, which went bankrupt and some sustained. But at the same time, some other part of the retail sector has done hugely well, tremendously well.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Anvi. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for basically highlighting this current pandemic issue. So thank you, sir. And now I would like to request Srishti Nair to please unmute yourself and ask your questions, Srishti. And please turn on your video.
Good afternoon, sir. Myself, Srishti Nair. I'm a fourth-year learner. My question was again pertaining to the pandemic only, as to how the inclusion of a material adverse change clause in agreements, the inclusion or not including the same, has affected M&A transactions during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, so I must tell you, and I'll be very candid here, that none of us could have fathomed that we will see such time in our life. Okay, we of course we can tell you, we, because of our experience and our age, we seen through several ups and downs, several crashes, several situations of market where people lost, the companies lost jobs, maybe starting from the dot-com boom or the dot-com bust that we seen, then to the Lehman Brothers 2008, or before that, Anderson, etc., etc. We've seen the ups and downs hugely, but I don't think anybody expected or could have fathomed that we will see this sort of a day as well, where we all will be locked down, and therefore there is no such definition of force majeure or MAC, we call it MAC or MAE, which was there finding its place in the contracts. But what happened, I must tell you what happened, that we have beautiful judiciary system and some of the smartest, legal minds as judges operating in the country. Within the first 1.5 month, we saw some judicial pronouncements made by Delhi High Court and one by Supreme Court as well, and one by Bombay High Court, giving their position to how one can use the COVID-19 as a reason to excuse itself from performance obligation that it has in a contract. They are given few very good judgments. So we may not have the best of contracts in place to cover ourselves for this situation, which I'll be very candid. I mean, this is for the whole industry all over the world. I will not just say India, all over the world we had this, but we had the judiciary chipping in so quickly and so nicely to just educate the half of the business world that, mind you, you may be there, may not be there. Therefore, do not try to use it to your side until you are really affected. We also had at the same time regulators, Reserve Bank of India and Government of India, which has promulgated very quick laws to protect the companies or the corporate sector getting affected by it. Like insolvencies were abandoned, stayed, not to be initiated, like moratorium granted by Reserve Bank of India. So various measures were taken to assist the lawyers to interpret their contracts in the light of these pronouncements or these regulations here. So yes, we did not have a clause which will fit all at that time, but yeah, we had the help of these very early judgments. We wrote some articles on these 4 or 5 judgments as well, which you must read, as to how court has interpreted these things very quickly, which is, I mean, sometimes in some areas favoring the company, trying to say that they could not perform because of COVID, and at one time telling them, no, you are not affected by COVID, at least not this performance, therefore you should pay damages compensation. Yeah.
So just a small follow-up question. Given the fact that a pandemic has occurred, companies when getting into contracts would obviously be more careful regarding inclusion of such clauses. So when it comes to M&A transactions, whether a force majeure clause or a MAC or a MAE clause would be a more preferred or a more suitable clause, which one would be a more suitable clause?
Say it again. What is it?
So the question is as to whether in a pandemic situation, whether a force majeure clause or a MAC clause, like which one would be a more suitable clause for companies to include in their contracts in order to cover a situation like COVID-19 probably?
You know what? A force majeure is usually, so you need to understand how these things are interplayed. In any M&A deal, there are important milestones. The first milestone is the closing of the transaction. Closing means when somebody is putting money or investing into the company where the commitment was made, or buying the business that it committed to buy. If you have any clause which is a force majeure clause diluting your commitment to buy, it will not work. Nobody will agree. Force majeure clause is usually for your running covenants or running obligations in a contract here. What you can or cannot perform once the contract has started here. Only a material adverse effect or a material adverse change is an acceptable clause for triggering your requirement to not to contribute money or not to buy business in any M&A transaction here. So you have to stay focused on the MAC only when it talks about the M&A deals.
Thank you so much, sir.
And I must tell you one, very interesting example on this one is that there was, I was just trying to look at the number, I'm forgetting the number. Just give me 1 second. So I don't know how much you people followed. There was a company called Tiffany and Company, which was agreed to be bought by by Louis Vuitton, and the buyer quoted COVID-19 as a reason to come out of the deal. Then Tiffany sued the buyer that you cannot use this and sued them for damages of some, I think, $2-3 billion. But eventually they agreed to buy the company at a discount of some $500 million. They still bought the deal at, $440 million was the discount given by Tiffany because the deal was not closed. The deal had to close, and before they could have closed the deal, COVID-19 happened, and obviously it affected the valuations. So it always happens that the deal does not happen before it's closed because of a reason there. But in that case as well, because they did not have a very rock solid exit clause from that transaction, they eventually had to buy it, but they got a discount of like $500 million dollar on the valuation over a 14-15 billion dollar valuation there.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Now I would like to request Meenakshi to please unmute yourself. But due to some internet connectivity, she will not be able to switch her video. But I request Meenakshi, please unmute yourself and please ask your question.
Yes, sir. Hello, sir. Sir, I'm Meenakshi Dhakar, second year learner. So my question to you is that as we know that nowadays data is used as one of the major resources. So can two parties contribute data of their consumers in order to enter into joint venture? For example, like Facebook and Amazon is contributing the data of the consumers and thereby entering into joint ventures?
I don't think that can be answered that easily. Data, I'm sure you all know, is the new gold mine of the world. Gold mine, or I don't know, platinum mine, or whatever the mine is. Data is the future. And today, two companies are not allowed to share data that freely. No way Facebook can share the data that they have of their users with somebody else. Yeah, there are some limited sharing can happen, which has been permitted in writing by the customers to that extent. But yeah, data can't be shared like this. Data is the future. I'm sure we all know that how these new companies or the new age companies are just making sure that they are collecting enough data to have as much as possible of artificial intelligence to, which I'm not subscribing to myself, but yes, I think their pitch is that they are creating this artificial intelligence to one day create ease of life for all of us. But sharing of that data is not yet permitted. And not just that, if it is a financial data, then I'm sure all of you would have seen the regulations which are in place requiring the companies to maintain and retain that data only in India and not to go out of India. And connected to data, I must tell you, the business that has picked up in last 5 years is the business of data centers. Some billions of dollars of investments we have done in the recent past where investors have invested into the data centers in India. There are these large, massive, mammoth data centers getting created and already created in Bangalore and Hyderabad and various other, IT cities to store data. It's amazing how the data centers are becoming a big business, and they're becoming big business for people to set up data centers. They're becoming big business for investors to invest. So before that, it's becoming big business for people to set up data centers. It is becoming business for those data center owners to lease their data centers to various users of the area. And then it became big investment point for the pension funds to invest into the data centers because of the study and the sustainable the income from the data centers. So it's a new huge big business opportunity.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And your point is actually very well connected with this recent, you can say, when this UP government has given its node for rupees 600 crore data center park near Greater Noida. So this approval has been given just a few days back only. So now we can understand really well that data is the gold only.
Yeah, but they're a little behind. They should have done it just 5 years before, or at least 3 years. But it's still a good move. This is still hugely growing right now.
Yes. So I would like to request Kabir Mohan to please unmute yourself and switch on your video, and you may please ask your question, Kabir.
So am I audible?
Yeah.
Good afternoon. So this is Kabir. I'm a third year learner from the 2018-2023 batch. My question was, as you also talked about how valuations obviously have taken a hit during the COVID times, and like how the Tiffany and LV deal also fell through because of it. And as valuation is such an important part of such M&A transactions, how are companies, or like how are lawyers who are handling these transactions taking care of these changes in valuation during this like short period of COVID times? As it might be that after the pandemic hit, the valuation might recover, or how are they handling this valuation problem?
Yeah, but I must say one thing, that I will not say that valuations have taken a hit for all the companies. If you read today's Economic Times as well, in last over 30 days, less than 30 days, the valuations of Tesla have gone up from $396 billion to some $600 billion. Mind blowing, And are people buying more cars? Of course not. Have people bought more cars during pandemic? Obviously not. They have not. And if you look around, valuations of top 50 companies in the world, they've only gone up, not gone down, including without limitations, Reliance Industries. It's over $200 billion. So valuations have not taken hit. As a generic rule, during pandemic, yes, there are some companies where aviation, airlines, hotels, which have taken a huge hit, or cinema, etc. They've taken a huge hit here. Number one. Number two, sometimes the valuations are dynamic, that I spoke about. Dynamic means that I'm a growing company today. I can be valued at, let's say 100 million today. I know fully well that I will perform or outperform myself in next 12, 18, 24 months. So I will not sell my shares to somebody at 100 million. This is where the role of lawyers come in, where we will provide an instrument which is convertible instrument. So investor will invest today, will be guaranteed some minimum equity shareholding in me today. Okay. But will get the shareholding at the valuation 2 years hence. I'll say, okay, I have taken, let's say if I today is valued in my same example, 100 million. If somebody is contributing 10 million today, I will say that I will give you not less than, X percentage, but I will determine your shareholding not at 100 million. So you'll not get 10%. You will get what you should get at my valuations 2 years hence. So let's say after 2 years, if from 100 I'm becoming 500, or becoming, let's say, 300 or 200, then for your 10 million, you may only get 2-3% depending on what that value in future is. So these are what we call it ratchet mechanisms. These are a little more complicated than basic thinking, but these are convertible instruments where the ratchets can be built in, where the instrument will get opened up. There will be a compulsorily convertible preference shares. So you will still hold a equity shares today, or you will hold a debenture in me, compulsorily convertible debenture, where I'll compulsorily and mandatorily convert you, not today, after 2 years, once my new business plan or my new financials are in place. And then at that value, I'll convert you. And that's how the lawyers basically keep writing these agreements. If you look at any of the newish company, which I named some, where investments were made of, maybe I call them e-commerce and the ecosystem companies, or the payment gateways, which are again part of e-commerce ecosystem, or the Paytm sort of companies, or Ola and Uber. Investments into these companies of billions of dollars came into these mechanisms only, whereby they were getting the convertible instruments, which will get converted at a value in future that can be benchmarked to their performance, or can be benchmarked to the valuation given to them by some new incoming investor. Either of that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now, the point is which you actually raised during your conversation about this goodwill. Actually, even this valuation concept is it is a very subjective concept. So even we can understand a lot of things from valuation, because in M&A, valuation plays a very crucial role. So thank you, sir, for pondering over this point specifically. And now I would like to request Neha. Neha, will you please unmute yourself and switch on your video, and may you please ask your question, Neha?
Yes, sir. Sir, good afternoon. This is Neha Thirani from 5th year. Firstly, sir, thank you so very much. This was a very, very informative session. Sir, I would just want you to throw some light on the deal, which the entire debacle of Amazon with the Future Retail, how they bought stakes in 2019 in Future Retail. But later, since they faced losses due to the entire pandemic, they went ahead with a slum sale with Reliance Industries. So, was this possible under the specific law? Could you just throw some light over this entire situation?
I'm so sorry, I will not be able to speak about that because I advised Amazon for this investment when they invested into Future, and I'm still advising them in this dispute which is going on at the arbitration at the Delhi High Court. I'm so sorry.
Oh, so sorry, sir. I didn't know that. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Ramal, this is, I only worked on this investment. And okay, on the valuation, I think you picked a very good point. Rajneesh, is that valuations are no more the piece of science, it's the piece of art, in my view. How well you can describe your company. And I think some of these companies are overly valued because of the, the value lies in the eye of beholder. Is there somebody saying you are valued $600 billion Tesla car company, whereas the General Motors is valued at $20 billion? I mean, it defies all the logics. How many cars have they sold? What are they trying to sell in the market here? And maybe, of course, they are selling future. They think the battery cars are the future here. But then people like us, maybe, I can speak for myself, is that I don't think the future can be in batteries. I think the future could be in air and water. One doesn't know what holds the future for us. But yes, this excessive valuation which is getting into these companies is only reminding me of our dot-com boom and the dot-com bust that happened. And we see it ourselves, we'll not name some companies which were valued, maybe WeWorks, we know very well, valued at some $15 billion, and all of a sudden, $500 million. What happened? What somebody has done there? Why such a drastic change that happens here? Including in India, we had some companies valued at $5 billion, and all of a sudden, not even now $100 million people are willing to pay them. They are the large e-commerce, fourth, fifth largest company. Yeah, so it's all, I think,
Exactly, sir.
Exactly, idea.
Exactly, sir. This valuation concept is actually, this concept has become so, you can say, a kind of dramatic thing, because right now, and even the companies which are even earning losses since last 10 years, the e-commerce companies, even they are valued at a very high level. So, when we teach and when we read this financial concepts of valuation, so we basically refer Warren Buffett, how he used to calculate the values by using the intrinsic value method. So that is another thing, sir, which is actually relevant for all M&A learners. So thank you, sir. Thank you very much for pondering over this point.
What happens that not today, some 6, 7 years, maybe a little more, 6, 7 years ago, one of the these new age company was doing a fundraise, and they were raising some $150 million, like a lot of money that time, some 800 crore rupees. And there were like bunch of youngsters, and I went to meet them in their office, full of energy. Obviously, the business was booming at that time. So I asked him a question. So I hope you have somebody to do the treasury function for this money. He said, sir, वो क्या होता है? मैंने कहा नहीं 800 करोड़ रुपए आएंगे और ट्रेजरी कहीं तो इन्वेस्ट करेगा, कुछ तो इंटरेस्ट उसमें कमाएगा. So they did not even know what treasury can do in your company, and you'll be sitting on a piles of cash, because they done Series B, Series C, Series D, Series E, and they had some, at that point in time, some thousands of crores of rupees of cash lying with them without having a treasury function in place. And therefore, those companies, went down so quickly, because when they wanted to switch from company A to company B for their business, I said, no, you lose the benefit of the carry forward loss. I said, sir, so what? We'll make more loss. This was the answer. We'll make more loss. So when you do not apply traditional business principles, in my view, some will sustain, who will survey down the line, will do some good business, and most of these guys who are riding a, this bull run may not see a very good future.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to request Yashvardhan to please unmute yourself and please switch on your video, Yashvardhan. You may please ask your question.
Good afternoon, sir. So I'm a first year BBLLB learner, sir. My name is Yashwardhan Sharma, sir. So I would like to ask you two questions, sir. So I would like to ask you to throw some light upon cross-border mergers, sir, and especially regarding Indian pharmaceutical companies at this COVID pandemic situation time, sir. So do you think it would be smart enough for Indian pharmaceutical companies to merge with foreign companies where there is so much of demand of vaccines at this time? And sir, do you think it will be advisable for or advantageous to them in the long run, or do you think foreign companies will take over the merger, sir? And so my next question to you is regarding the regulations that the Indian government and laws have imposed on the Indian government laws have imposed on mergers, so like the Companies Act 1956, Foreign Management Act 1999. So don't you think that they should relax some regulations in according to make the mergers more easier and less of a pain for the companies?
Yeah, okay. So one of the gainers, I mean, we spoke about some of the gainers during the pandemic are, of course, the healthcare and the pharmaceutical companies. They gained a lot. They gained the most. So is it the right time for the Indian pharmaceutical companies to sell themselves out to do any merger acquisitions with a foreign company? May not necessarily be. I think I don't know how many of you know that India is the largest producer of vaccines in the world. So this is not the time to sell. This is the time to just hold your guns, not to be in a hurry. Yeah, and I think in terms of the government regulations, I think the governments keep doing their work. I think they have done enough. They should do more. Of course, we are working with lots of the government departments to ease out their rules and regulations for for letting these transactions happen, which are in the best interest of the country. Why? Because every penny invested has a multiple effect on the income. So, it is called the investment multiplier or the income multiplier. So when you invest 1 rupee into economy, the multiplied effect on the income generated in the economy could be 5 times, 10 times. So every rupee invested into business will have the income yielding in the economy of 10 rupees. And therefore, they will have to do whatever more they can do as the government to attract more and more investments so that the country can do very well. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Okay, guys, I think it's time.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. And
thank you, everyone. And I must say, a few more things before we go. It's just the first round. I think I'll take you through some other things in the next round. Is that again? I think we need to keep ourselves fully informed of what's happening surrounding us as the first step to be a corporate lawyer. I mean, corporate lawyer, what I feel, or a corporate M&A lawyer, I feel that you will have to be a business lawyer. I mean, it's a fusion of business and law. We just cannot be overly lawyer about it. We cannot be overly businessman about it. I mean, because a businessman can do their job better than us when we are not the business people. But yes, he may not be able to do without you because you will understand the business domain and you understand the laws pertaining to that business domain better than somebody else here. So as a corporate lawyer, I always feel a domain knowledge is must. And a domain knowledge can only be taken by you, by yourself. None of us here on the screen can inculcate this thing in your mind here. It depends on you how best you can get it. I mean, learner, I love this word that's used by Mr. Ramal, learner. I mean, you guys are the learners. I mean, I'm a learner at the end of the day. I keep learning. I keep my ear, eyes, mind very open every day because it is my objective to learn something new every day. So when I listen to people, I really want to learn what they want to say because learning can really improve us and can make us better every day here. Therefore, keep your ear, mind, eyes open. Keep your ears to the ground here to know what's happening in the business world here. What's happening in the business laws here? What new laws are getting promulgated? What new regulations are there? Keep reading them. Keep reading about the new judgments. Keep discussing with each other. Keep discussing with your, with your, I don't know how much you can discuss with your professors and teachers, but yeah, whenever you can, please do that. Make sure you get the best out of it. Picking up the magazines, and I can tell you, I'm coming from an era where to read anything about any company, either we had very limited newspapers available, when we had no business channels giving the business news in the country, we had very limited business newspapers available, or we really had to wait for a monthly magazine to read the business here. I mean, we would get to know about business after a month. Imagine when I was doing economics honors in SRCC, we had to wait for time or be told by a peer as to what's going on. And today, the information is available to all of you at the press of button. And not even press of button. I think by just saying, "Hey Google," you can get to know whatever is happening in the world here. Things have changed. It simply means two things: that if there is so much available, are we learning so much? Are you guys learning proportionately that higher in proportion to what more is available today? If it is not, then we're letting this whole available information getting wasted. Let's get the most out of it. I think let's get as much as possible out of what's happening surrounding us. And I can again tell you, I did not speak much about COVID-19 at the beginning of my session, because I'm sure all of you must have been spoken a lot about the challenging or the most challenging time that we are going through. But I think the light, I can see the light at the end of the tunnel here right now. I'm sure we all can see. We are seeing a vaccination here, and what we have been hearing and observing is that this is once in 100-year sort of a situation. I think we all will be better, stronger. We will be able to deliver far, more than a lot of others, because we've been through this grind here today. So you have to remain very motivated. You have to still learn through the these e-channels, which was not the best mode when we used to study. But yes, still try and get the most out of it. Try and get as much as you can when you are on the screen.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for making these points clear to our learners. And specifically, like, I just want to say only one thing in this entire context. I will not take much of your time, so I know very well, like, the importance of time. So I simply say, Hastasya bhushanam danam, satyam kanthasya bhushanam, shrotasya bhushanam shastram, bhushane ki priyojanam. So simply, as we say, like, हाथ का भूषण गहना है या दान है, और गले का भूषण सत्य है, और कान का भूषण सबसे बड़ा शास्त्र सुनने में। और सबसे बड़ी बात, this kind of learning which we basically get from such experienced person, such knowledgeable person regarding up this particular domain, because when I used to teach this M&A in SLS Noida, and whenever I used to teach this M&A specifically, then I simply say M&A is not a single subject. Actually, it includes everything. So it includes company law, securities law, competition law, taxation law, GST, stamp duty, foreign exchange management, IPR. It includes everything. So whenever I say mergers and acquisitions, M&A, so I do not say it is mergers and acquisitions. Basically, it requires master of all. So you have to be knowledgeable from management perspective, from law perspective, or from economics perspective as well, sometimes, to understand the true context of this M&A. So thank you very much, sir. Thank you for this enlightening session. Now I would like to request our director, sir, to please take this session forward, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajneesh. And as always, it has been an experience to learn better things from Mr. Hardeep. And the August gathering who is present here, they may be aware that when we started this campus in the year 2010, and our relations with Mr. Hardeep goes that date back, and that is the day until date. As and when required, Mr. Hardeep is just a caller. So thank you very much, sir. You always have been so kind. And I would like to inform the August gathering as well that the second session of the master class is scheduled on Wednesday, the coming Wednesday. That is December 16, 2020. Timings are the same, 11:30 to 1. And you all can join with the same. The ones who are from the law school, they will be joining directly, and the ones who have rather shown their and have submitted their letter of interest that they would like to attend, you can use the same link and you can join us again. And there is much to learn, and please participate. There are series of events which we are organizing. And this always has been the practice at the Symbiosis Law School, Noida, that all our events are open to all, and you are always welcome to join and become part of this learners fraternity. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And special thanks to Mr. Hardeep for his, because we know how busy and how important your time is, but you always see to it that it's our time to give back as well, and you always are there. So thank you very much, sir. And thank you very much to Mr. Rajneesh for moderating the session so well. So thank you very much. And we take your permission, Mr. Hardeep, Mr. Rajneesh, and everyone present here, and we end the session. Thank you very much and have a nice day to you all. Namaste.